Yeah, Russian intelligence, let's go back to their history. What are they about? What defines them? Terror. Terror defines the Russian intelligence services. The NKVD, the OGPU, the MGB, the KGB, all different names. Today it's the FSB. They stand for organized terror. Democracy is the greatest threat to Vladimir Putin.
Sean Wiswesser, a former CIA senior operations officer and chief of station. Sean is a veteran national security professional with 30 years of experience in intelligence and defense. He served multiple overseas tours, including in war zones. Sean is an international lecturer on Russian espionage and author of book Tradecraft, Tactics, and Dirty Tricks.
So when the Russians use the narrative of fascisti, they know it evokes emotion. They target emotion. And they don't fundamentally care one way or another. They just want to label. They just want to create dissension. They just want Americans fighting each other. And he's not going to stop in Ukraine unless we stop him. Now they can do it with AI. Now they can do it in cognitive warfare. So I believe it's the greatest existential threat to democracy today is cognitive warfare. We choose half measures. We're only going to have more war because Putin's not going to stop. We have to be smarter. We can't allow ourselves to be duped.
So, Sean, thank you so much for having this podcast with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's an honor to talk about issues I'm passionate about, Russian intelligence, the Ukraine war, so it's an honor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we will dive in the topic of the Russian intelligence, the tradecraft, and so on, I would like to raise the first question so that you open up for the audience. What first actually drew you to Russia, the history, the language, and eventually to the intelligence work?
Yeah, so at first it was a pretty fairly simple decision. I went to a boarding school. I won a scholarship as was not a wealthy kid. I had a chance to go to a great college prep school in 9th grade. And we had to pick a language. We were going to do a language for 4 years. Russian was the exception. It was the only language that was kind of different. They had French, German, Spanish, and Russian. And so I thought, why not do something different? Not a lot of people have studied. And I thought maybe I might want to go into a military career. And the Soviet Union was our adversary. This is in the 1980s. This is a long time ago, 40 years ago almost now. So I thought, on a kind of a whim, I said, okay, I'll take Russian. But then as I studied it for 4 years in high school, I really developed a real interest in the language, the culture, the people. And so then I continued on. I eventually got a second bachelor's degree in Russian. I was a history major, but in college I got a second bachelor's in Russian. So that's how it started, my interest in Russian language. And then that fed into my later career, of course, as a diplomat and then eventually as a CIA officer.
Actually, after the career in the government service, many people choose not publicly write about the intelligence, but you're the one who decided to write a book, and particular book about the tradecraft and how exactly Russian intelligence works. Why did you decide after finishing the career in the government to write this particular book?
So this fed out of my career with CIA in particular, working Russian intelligence. You know, I would never write a memoir. I'm not interested in writing a memoir to talk about my life. I think that's all kind of boring, at least for me. What I wanted to talk about now more than ever is our adversary, Russian intelligence. I think that they're not well understood in the West. They're not understood well in Europe or the United States. And so I spent a good bit of my career, you know, I spent 28 years in the intelligence community, some with State Department, most of that over 2 decades with CIA. And when I was with CIA, I taught a lot. I taught at other intelligence community academies, FBI, DHS, CIA, of course, at our own academy. And I relate some of that in the book. But the book is focused on Russian intelligence. It's on their tactics, their techniques. 10 chapters focused on how they do their craft, because I think it's so misunderstood in the West. And I thought with things like the 2016 election meddling, both in the United States and in Britain, Brexit, what the Russians call active measures, I thought there needs to be more awareness of this. You know, they're attacking democracy. They're trying to undermine democracy worldwide. The most vivid example of that, the most stark example is, of course, in your country, Ukraine. Ukrainians fighting for their very existence. You know, nowhere is the struggle for democracy more stark than in Ukraine right now. So I wanted to do my part. That was the inspiration for the book, do my part to explain Russian intelligence. Fortunately, the book's gotten a good welcome. Readers, I think, are finding it easy to read. I wrote it for the general public, so that was the inspiration.
I actually read your book, and I really remember the way you described how you started to travel and lecture the intelligence services and that, because you basically saw this like gap, right, that needs to be filled up, if I can say like this, and making sure that your knowledge is and all your experience, basically you can spread it further. And what if we talk about the ordinary reader who is not an intelligence officer, what maybe the most important thing you would like for people to understand how exactly those Russian intelligence work?
Yeah, so I'll start with the dedication of the book. I quote Lermontov. I studied Russian literature, a great admirer of their culture, their traditions. We're not at war with the Russian people. Fundamentally, we're at war with a repressive regime, an autocracy. Vladimir Putin, his siloviki, all that empower them, the Russian military, the organy власти, as the Russians talk about, organy власти, the FSB, the SVR, the GRU, and the military, they're waging this horrible, atrocious war against Ukraine. They're waging a hybrid war for 20 years now against the West. That's the subtitle of my book, Russian Intelligence and Putin's Secret War. They've been at war with us for a long time. This predated the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, the 2008 invasion of Georgia. All the while in the West, we sort of weren't paying attention. We allowed ourselves to believe, Putin, we saw him, as he wanted himself to be seen. He was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He portrayed himself as, Tony Blair was famous for saying, we can work with Putin. George Bush, of course, our own president, who I admire. I think he was a great president, but his famous quote, we looked into the soul of the man, got a sense for the soul. I think he's someone we can trust. Well, we can't. We can never trust him. He always was committed to autocracy. He said himself early in his presidency, the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I believe fundamentally, and in the CIA that I worked in, we always knew Putin was a threat to democracy, a threat to the West. And he's now revealed his design. His design is he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. He set out for it. It doesn't end with Ukraine. It continues with the Baltics. He's a dictator with grievances. We should remember dictators with grievances. My God, how much damage, destruction, calamity in the 20th century was caused by dictators with grievances like Hitler, who said, well, I'm going to set history straight the way I see fit. Look at Putin's speech from 2021, where he lays out his case, Ukraine has no right to exist. Was never even a country. That's his argument. So we didn't do a good enough job countering Putin, and now we're stuck. We're in a really bad spot now. He's waging all-out war, killing tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of his own people, certainly tens of thousands of Ukrainians. Ukrainian children have died by the thousands. And he's not going to stop in Ukraine unless we stop him. So that's the message of the book. This has been happening a long time. This wasn't built overnight. And we need to do a better job in the West seeing it for what it is and countering it.
And you already mentioned actually that some people really misunderstand the way the Russian intelligence work. And maybe you can share some examples with us of this kind of misunderstanding, the way they operate.
Yeah, in the West, we tend to project our understanding of law-based societies. We project it on our adversaries. We just don't know any better. So you'll hear Western commentators, even learned scholars that look at Russian government, they'll say things like, oh, well, the FSB, that's the equivalent of the FBI. No, it's not. It's got nothing to do with the FBI or the British Security Service or any functioning democratic security services. In Russia, the FSB is a giant, monolithic, corrupt bureaucracy dedicated to one thing. That's keeping Vladimir Putin in power and the system that sustains him and sustains their own corruption. It totals nearly 500,000 officers in the FSB. It's a giant bureaucracy, at least 400,000 strong, with 200,000 border troops. And all the other intelligence services, they're running the roost. They're ruling Russia today. And so I think we don't understand this in the West. Look at how Putin presents the members of the siloviki, the strongmen, men of power, just the very term siloviki. Look at how he presents them when he's holding important meetings. These are all his close KGB hardliners. They're the ones that surround him. Before he invaded Ukraine in 2022 with the full-scale invasion, what did he do? Remember, 1 week before that, gathered all those key Silovikian ministers. He had them all state for the record on Russian TV. How do you feel about the 4 eastern oblasti, Ukraine? You know, should they be a part of Russia? That was his way of making sure they all stated the case for war. And so remember when when Narishkin, the head of the SVR, he didn't speak up enough, he was mumbling, and he said, well, you know, I'm za. Okay, I'm za. He's like, well, Sergei, speak plainly. You know, откровенно прямо, скажите. He wanted them to say, hey, boom, I want to hear it on the record. Are you for the war or not? Because he wanted it clear for the whole world, the Russian people in the whole world. These are my guys. This is my government. We're all in this together. We're all aligned together so that no one later could say, well, you know, I wasn't for the war. Я был против лично. No, nobody could say that. He put them all in the air. So it's telling how he does business. He's an autocrat. He's been at this now 26 years. He makes it clear. He's calling the shots. And he plays all of his lieutenants against each other. So I think, again, we do a poor job understanding this is a security state built to keep Putin in power. All those Siloviki, they're completely beholden to him for all of their wealth, all of their golden palaces. Why was Navalny killed? He was killed because he was doing documentaries. He was showing the Russian people, look at how they live. Look at these golden palaces they build in Sochi and in Moscow. And the Russians were watching it. Democracy is the greatest threat to Vladimir Putin. Democracy is what he's after. Can't have Ukraine, a functioning democracy on his border. Have to destroy that. That's too much of a threat. Can't have the Baltics functioning democracies either. They're the next step. So again, I think we need to do a better job understanding him and his regime for what it is.
What do you think, what does the Russian intelligence understand about the human weaknesses? Maybe something that democratic societies often underestimate.
Yeah, Russian intelligence, let's go back to their history. What are they about? What defines them? Terror. Terror defines the Russian intelligence services. Dzerzhinsky said it himself, the founder of the Cheka, the first committee for the defense of the revolution. Felix Dzerzhinsky, famous Iron Felix, he stated on the public record, we stand for organized terror. Okay, and everything that they've been about for 100 years, you've seen this, okay? So the follow-on successors, the NKVD, the OGPU, the MGB, the KGB, all different names. Today it's the FSB. They stand for organized terror. It's about terrorizing the Russian people. It's keeping a chokehold on them. Absolutely no freedoms whatsoever. Can't have freedom of the press. Can't even have the suggestion that they're fighting a real war, right? For 4 years now, it's been against the law for Russians to even say, are we at war? Even though now some of even their spokesman, Peskov, he made the mistake recently, but he won't be put on trial. But how many simple, ordinary Russians, they can't even say they're at war. They're dying by the hundreds of thousands. They have 1.5 million in casualties. So terror defines the state. And then they export terror. They export coercion as a form of foreign policy. Let's look at examples. The Russian state has murdered people. And when they have carried out those murders, it's clear that Putin sanctions them. Let me give you an example. The FSB officer, Vadim Krasikov, is an assassin. He was a personal bodyguard to Putin. This is what we mean when we talk about the thugocracy that is Russia today. In 2019, Krasikov, the story is, within the services, he volunteered, said, let me do this for you. You know, they call Putin the boss in Russian. They call him chef. I dealt with debrief Russian intelligence officers. Within their systems, he's chef. Ну, так мы говорят, так говорят, chef. He's the boss. In a similar way, Stalin used to be called Khazyain in his time. He's the boss man. He's running the whole show, like the Khazyain of a kolkhoz, you know. So the boss wanted somebody killed. He wanted a Chechen dissident killed in Germany. Krasikov, a personal bodyguard, apparently volunteered to do this. He was caught immediately, broad daylight. He killed the Chechen dissident and was arrested. And he spent 5 years in prison until Putin insisted any trade with the West, this hostages, innocent civilians like Brittany Griner or Evan Gershkovich, a Wall Street Journal reporter. So Putin said, I want Krasikov. He told, it was clear in the negotiations, I want my guy out. And the Russians had denied he was an FSB officer, even though it was clear he's an intelligence officer. So what happened? Putin got his way. There was no trade without Krasikov. And he met him on the airport, and he gave him half a bear hug and a firm handshake on the red carpet. He wanted his guys to see his terrorists that are his intelligence officers, when you kill for me, when you kill under my orders, I will take care of you. I will get you out. And he did. He got Kraskov out. And then within days, Peskov, the spokesperson, admitted, yes, he's an FSB officer, and we decorated him for what he... This is a state that carries out murder by order of the president, and he greets the murderer on the tarmac of the airport. So I think it's, again, hard for us in the West to understand and comprehend a president who personally orders murders and whose regime carries out murders. They killed Polokhovskaya. They killed Nemtsov. They killed Navalny. We have conclusive proof of this. This is a murderous regime that kills on orders for the president and then carries out wars by his order too, and that killed tens of thousands of civilians in your country, Ukraine. It's only with the collective resolve in the West when we wake up to the threat, we recognize him for who he is. We recognize this regime for what it is, a murderous regime that carries out hits for a boss, much like a mafia state. Only then can we really counter it.
Thank you so much for, again, bringing these examples. And I think the West really did not understand that this is a regime of murder. That's for sure.
Yeah, and there's those that, I'll just add, there's those that still don't see it. You know, we just had a government in Hungary that thankfully was finally replaced. Thankfully for the Hungarian people, chose a new leader, you know. And I try to stay out of politics. I try to stay apolitical. But in the case of a foreign minister in Hungary who's caught on the record, it's telling, by the way, the tapes that were leaked. Who knows who leaked them? Maybe even Russian intelligence themselves. What should the Hungarians know and focus on? Look at what's been revealed. There were more Russian intelligence officers working in the embassy under Orban, under his government that was friendly to Russia. They had more Russian intelligence officers working at that embassy than any point ever. It shows there are no friends for Russia. You're not going to win over Putin and his government. There are no friends. It's a zero-sum game. It's them against the West, against all democracies. And so Europe needs to recognize that we're in this together. NATO, the United States, Europe, we're in this together. And we should do more to support Ukraine as well.
Now if we talk about the term of hybrid warfare, now it's used like very, very often. But when people hear about hybrid warfare, they usually think about fake news or something like that. But your work actually includes sabotage, cyber attacks, proxies, assassinations, criminal hackers, and covert influence. So can you explain how this all of these pieces comes together and fit?
Yeah, so my research on hybrid war really started just prior to the Ukraine war starting. I was getting my master's at U.S. Air War College, as part of our great war college program. I was still in government. But then the Ukraine war kicked off. Unfortunately, your country was invaded. And I wanted to look at sort of how they planned this, how this came about. Why did the Russians think they could win? So I was publishing a couple books. One was with Army War College called Call to Action, to learning the lessons of the war. And I was publishing another war called The Air War in Ukraine by Cambridge Publishing House, and Justin Bronk is editor, a very well-known air power expert. I focused on air power, the Russian air power failure, in both those books and in my thesis, which was published in the UK, but I looked at it from a hybrid war standpoint. And I've written in my current book as well, chapter 10 is about how the Russians applied their hybrid war doctrine. Russians don't call it hybridная война, that's a cognate from the English language. Russians call it война нового поколения, so warfare of the next generation. They also call it бесконтактная война. And so they've been looking at this for a long time, focused on this for over 20 years. It's worth a really quick mention because this is their history. This is what they were planning and coming up with. 20 years ago, some Russian general staff figures like Makhmut Gareev, another guy named Valery Slipchenko, these were generals writing about how is Russia going to successfully, potentially wage war against NATO. They knew technologically they could never meet the resources of the United States and our NATO allies. They knew they couldn't match us in the air power for air power. They weren't fools. So what they started to believe and what they wrote in this book called Al Budishik Voin, On Future Wars, in 2004. In 2004, that's 22 years ago, the Russians are writing about a new generation of warfare. In the West, we're not even paying attention, right? We're not paying attention at all. These are well-known generals, and one of them, Slipchenko, wrote in the book, if we can't understand and practice non-contact warfare, Russia won't survive. So what did they talk about? Using information war as a continual second front against their adversaries. An idea later picked up by Valery Gerasimov, the current chief of the general staff, who in 2013 wrote a famous paper about this, and then gave a speech and wrote a paper for a magazine called Courier in Russian. And so this became known in the West. People called it the Gerasimov Doctrine. Well, he didn't come up with it. It wasn't his idea. He was just continuing the idea. So the Russians have been looking at this for 20 years. And this concurrently happened at a time when you had a former intelligence officer, a former FSB director, become president. So the Russian intelligence services, naturally, corrupt bureaucrats that they were, they said, yeah, we can do this. We volunteer. We'll do information warfare against the West, sabotage. We'll carry out what they call aktivные мероприятия, information operations. And they had testing and proving grounds for it. Georgia was one of them in 2008. Syria was another proving ground. Try to incapacitate the ability of the democracies in the West to react. I happen to know something about Georgia. I served in that region. CIA doesn't want me to exactly state where. I was in the region when the Russians invaded. The news was filled with a lot of confusing propaganda. Oh, the Russian army has to save the poor people of Ossetia and Abkhazia. Don't tell that to the Abkhazians and South Ossetians, because Russia didn't do anything for them. They didn't rebuild those provinces formerly of Georgia. They just invaded and took them over. Same thing in 2014, right? We have to rescue the poor people of the Donbass that are suffering. What did they do, by the way, between 2014 and 2022? As we all know, Russia did nothing to invest in the Donbass. They did no reconstruction. They didn't do anything in the territories they occupied from 2014. So it's all a narrative to confuse, not necessarily to convince, but their information warfare is designed to confuse the West. Now add on a new level of escalation that they've always planned, but they've been carrying out since 2022. Cable cuts in the Baltic Sea, more cuts of important infrastructure, critical lines in the Baltic Sea than in any other waterway in the world. And the Balts, they know it. The Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, they're not naive about it. Across the Baltic Sea, I'm not so sure. There was a Finnish court that arrested a captain. I was in Helsinki giving a talk in October. They released the captain of the crew who drug his anchor for 65 kilometers and cut 2 cable lines. This is Russian hybrid warfare. Pay the captain off from the GRU or FSB, cut these cable lines, carry out arson in Poland, a giant shopping center, take down a cargo plane in Lithuania, arson in the UK, assassination attempt against a German CEO. This is Vojna Novого Pokolenia. This is warfare of the next generation. But the Russians planned it, and they've been at it a long time. So I just think it's, again, not very well understood in the West.
And also you write in your article that Europe is already under attack, as we already mentioned, through these hybrid methods. And maybe for an American audience, Europe can sometimes look like a distant theater, let us say, but it may actually be like a preview. And in your view, what should Americans learn from Europe's experience with Russian hybrid operations, and what types of activity in Europe should be understood as warnings for the United States?
Yeah, it's a great question. Listen, I believe fundamentally, I write a column for the Cipher Brief, and I wrote 6 months ago a piece entitled Echoes of 1940. Listen, it's really important that the United States remember and know that NATO is our strength, okay? This alliance that stood for 80 years. We stood together against Soviet potential aggression. What made the 20th century the American century wasn't American dominance. It was the fact that after World War II, when we defeated our adversaries, we rebuilt Europe. We rebuilt Japan, the Marshall Plan. The United States invested, countless billions of dollars to rebuild Europe. And the Europeans remembered that, and they loved the United States for that. And so NATO, it's all a legacy together. What we should remember of the alliance and what we accomplished in defeating Nazi aggression and Japan's attacking against the United States. But let's remember where we were before that, because there's a lot of analogies to the United States right now. Listen, Americans are war weary. We had 20 years of war. My generation of CIA officers, we deployed into war zones. I served in Afghanistan. I served twice in war zones. One CIA doesn't want me to talk about. But I served in Afghanistan. Many others served many, many times. We have millions of servicemen and women served. Americans don't want to talk about war. They don't want to even think about it. And there's an analogy after the Great War, World War I. Americans were also stuck in this isolationism. Europeans as well. Britain and France didn't want to think about war. And you had a dictator with grievances. You had Hitler saying, well, I got to have my grievances satisfied. I've used this quote. I was lecturing in the UK last month. It's so important to remember the quote from Churchill. Churchill was the only voice, one of the only voices in the 30s, screaming for Europe to stand united against German aggression. And nobody was listening to him. Oh, Winnie, he's just a fool. Don't listen to him. He's the fool that led to the Gallipoli campaign. Churchill said in 1938, when the British signed and the French signed appeasement of Hitler at Munich, Churchill said the choice was between dishonor and war. You chose dishonor and you'll have war. And nobody listened to him, and he was exactly right. In a similar way, the United States and Europe both have chosen half course, whether you call it dishonor or not. We've taken half measures with Ukraine. Well, maybe we can give Ukraine just enough to defend its territory, but we don't want them to really strike back against Russia. We've done half measures. We've done half prognostications, half measures to try to convince Russia in this war. It's not going to work. We live in a time of consequence, much like the 1930s, a time when decisions have consequences. And so we should remember, again, if we choose dishonor, if we choose half measures, we're only going to have more war because Putin's not going to stop. He views it as weakness when we don't counter him. Give the Ukrainians the tools they need to finish the job. Another quote from the 1930s and early 40s. Give the Ukrainians the tools. Give them long-range strike weapons like Ukraine is producing right now, those flamingos and others, attacking the energy sector. That will end this war. That's what matters to Putin. It's what matters to the Russian economy. And so I think it's so critical that as much as we don't want to think about war, we're confronted by war. War is upon us, for Americans too. It didn't protect us in 1941. It won't protect us again. We have to stand with our allies. Ukraine is one of them. We have to stand by our allies at war and do more to help.
Now, if we talk about the labeling and Ukraine, so in the recent OSCE Supplementary Human Dimension meeting in Vienna, our research center, ALLATRA Global Research Center, experts examined how repeated labeling can evolve from just words into stigmatization, isolation, and repression. And if we talk about the Ukraine and the labeling, so Russian state propaganda has repeatedly portrayed Ukraine and Ukrainians as fascists, and using this label, a false characterization aimed to discrediting a sovereign democratic nation defending its freedom. And from an intelligence tradecraft perspective, how is such a historical charged label weaponized?
Yeah, it's really, thank you, Valeria. It's important to talk about Russian information warfare, what they call активные мероприятия. So the Russians have always had it. For 100 years, they've been really good in information warfare. For the Russians, let's paint our adversary as we want the world to see them. So in my book, I talk about in chapter 9, the very definition of KGB, активные мероприятия, information warfare designed to weaken one's adversary by any means possible. You could pay off a journalist, recruit a journalist, put a fake story out in the news. One of them, I cite the example, the KGB fostered all sorts of assassination theories about JFK. Anytime they saw a new theory that could help with dissension within the United States population, they helped foster it. They paid for authors to write books, and I give examples of that. In a similar vein today, Russia wants to label any adversaries to the Russian Federation as they see it. Well, they're the aggressors. They're the ones not allowing peace. So as crazy as it is, to anyone objectively looking at it, we need to see also the strength of the Russian narrative when they blame NATO or they try to call Ukraine fascist. It does resonate with Russian-speaking populations. Why? Великая Отечественная война, the Great Patriotic War, was a horrible calamity for the Russian and Soviet peoples. My own wife's Lithuanian. On her Lithuanian side, her mother's side, her grandfather fought with the Lithuanian division of the Red Army. On her other side, her grandfather's Ukrainian from the middle of Ukraine, Kировogradskaya Oblast. Her mother was a Sibiriachka from Siberia. They met at the front. She was a battlefield nurse. They experienced horrible suffering. My wife's grandfather, Ukrainian grandfather, his village was wiped out in the war. There was no one left. His only surviving brother settled in the Baltics. That's how he ended up in the Baltics. That's just an example from my wife's family. You all know it. Your grandfathers and grandmothers. Ukraine suffered more than any other of the former Soviet republics, save maybe for Belarus. So when the Russians use the narrative of fascisti, they know it evokes emotion. They target emotion. Why is this important? In 2016, the active measures, the Russians use social meddling. How do they train on it? What I talk about in my research, my book. The Russians targeted the most emotional issues in the United States in a similar way to the way they target Ukrainians and trying to label them as fascists. In the United States, they targeted the abortion issue, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ issues. They target the issues that are emotional for Americans. And they don't fundamentally care one way or another. They just want to label. They just want to create dissension. They just want Americans fighting each other. And so, unfortunately, they're very good at it. They train on it. I call it SVR politology. Their foreign intelligence service has thousands of officers in what they call Directorate MS for their Управление мероприятий содействия. So the Directorate for Measures of Support, that's their current term for, they train on this. They've been doing this forever. They're very good at it. So labeling does matter. Unfortunately, it does influence some populations. I'll share one quick final anecdote on that point. I traveled to Mongolia. Was there a couple years ago, meeting with think tanks, talking with academics, very smart people, lovely, lovely people, Mongolians, I like them. But they were parodying and echoing the Russian narrative on the Ukraine war. Well, we can't have Russia destroyed as a state. Remember, they're just trying to counter NATO's aggression. These are smart, intelligent people, but they're buried in the propaganda of watching Russian news. And why do they watch the Russian news channels? They have good movies, they have good videos, they have good music. They always have for decades, right? So in the former Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Mongolia, they watch Russian news, and so it does matter. At the same time in the West, what are we doing? We took away resources from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Voice of America. This is foolhardy. This is crazy. At a time when we should be proud that the United States government doesn't control editorial content. For Voice of America, we never did. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, we should be bolstering that. We shouldn't be taking away resources. So Russia's strengthening their information warfare, their information operations, and in democracies, we don't know how to counter it. We take away the very resources we should be using to fight that. So it's a tough issue. It's not an easy, simple answer, but it's one I try to build awareness with in my book and also all my public speaking. Yeah.
In your article, Kremlin Files, Column, Rumor, and Reality, you warn against the notion that Ukraine is already winning and that the war is nearing its end. So why can this narrative harm public's understanding of the situation and weaken the willingness to continue to support Ukraine?
Yeah, this is really important right now. I've been speaking a lot about this in the past month. I had an article in Foreign Policy magazine, Don't Believe the Rumors of Putin's Weakness. I have the Cipher Brief article, The Myth of Russia's Imminent Collapse. And I would just point out, Ambassador Zaluzhny said himself just a week ago, this is dangerous for Ukraine. This idea, this constant talk in the West and press and supposed analysts and experts who I don't know what they're studying, but they keep talking about, oh, Russia's going to collapse now any day. It's over for Putin. He's going down. Listen, we all hope for that. We all wish for that. But wishful thinking is not going to save the tens of thousands of Ukrainians that are dying every year of this war. Russia's not just going to give up, unfortunately. This is a layered security state. 400,000 strong of the FSB, 300,000 strong of Rosgvardia, which Putin restructured in 2016 to make them personally loyal to him. He took key divisions out of the Ministry of Interior, like the Dzerzhinsky division, named after that terrorist, Felix Dzerzhinsky, named after him, made them personally loyal to him. 30,000 strong of the Federal Protective Service, the FSO. They're not just going to give up. Where are the mass protests in Russia, by the way? There haven't been any for 14 years. The last ones were in 2012. So I think it's a lot of wishful thinking. I think it's some intelligence services, too, that feed these targeted leaks to the press. It's been talked about in Europe, a number of countries. Oh, our intelligence service from country X in Europe is saying that Putin is now weaker than ever. Based on what? Based fundamentally on what? He's not going to be weaker until we, again, in the West, helping the Ukrainians, make him weak. Force the energy sector to collapse. It hasn't collapsed yet. There's long petrol lines in Crimea, thankfully. There's a lot of disruption. There's weakness. But there's not fundamentally a collapse. We're not there yet. So yeah, I believe this is a really dangerous narrative. I've been criticized in some quarters for it. People saying, oh, that's defeatist. You shouldn't be saying, no, it's realist. It's a realist view to say, here's where we are. I've spoken out every occasion I get a chance, just like today. I'm a strong believer in Ukraine. They deserve more. We should be doing more to help Ukraine. There's no greater defenders of democracy today in the world than the Ukrainian people. I compare in my own book, when you read chapter 10 of my book, I compare the young generation of Ukrainians fighting and dying for freedom are like the founding fathers of the United States. I can't make any stronger argument to show where I stand, what I believe in. But we're not doing enough. And if we act like the war is over, it's not over. Ukrainians are still dying. So yeah, it's a dangerous narrative. It's not a true narrative. It's not going to be that easy, unfortunately. It's going to take more of what Churchill called blood, toil, sweat, and tears. Unfortunately, most of the sweat and tears are on the poor Ukrainian people right now. I'm doing my part to try to advocate very strongly. Europe and the United States need to do more.
Thank you so much for pointing this out. And also, when I read that article, I remember that you explain also why it's dangerous, because some of the, hearing that Ukraine is doing very well, which is Ukraine is doing very well, it's true. But hearing that, some of the countries might say, oh, maybe we don't need to support it so much now.
Yeah.
They're doing very well, right? So
and it's happening.
That's how it's
yeah,
dangerous.
it's happening. The German defense minister, Pistorius, said 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was asked, hey, how about those Taurus long-range missiles now? Will Germany finally give them to Ukraine? Because the energy sector is, of course, the key sector. We've all known it for a long time, and Ukraine is valiantly fighting on and finding resources, their own innovation, like Flamingo. There's been talk about the U.S. should give them Tomahawks. I believe in it. I'm for it. We should give Ukraine Tomahawks. There's some problems there. Tomahawk might not be the right missile because it's usually sea-launched. But so the German defense minister is asked, what about the Taurus missiles? And what did he say? Well, maybe Ukraine doesn't need them. They're doing so well after all. No, that's nonsense. He's buying into this narrative. No stronger and better narrative for the Russians right now than for people in the West to believe, oh, hey, well, this war is done, right? The Ukrainians have won when there is no victory. There is no just peace. There are no security guarantees for Ukraine. And fundamentally, just for our American audience, I try to explain this a lot. You know this. You're living it. Ukrainians are breathing, and Ukrainians are dying for it. There's no fundamental peace for Ukraine unless you can take your young men and women off the front lines and let them rebuild your country. 40% of your infrastructure has been destroyed, your utilities, apartments in the East especially that need to be rebuilt. So as your heroic president's wisely pointed out, Ukraine has no future if you can't bring these troops back from the front lines. So if we don't have a secure peace for Ukraine, you can't rebuild your country. You can't bring the young men and women off the front lines. I don't think that's understood in the West enough, and that's not understood in the United States. So I try to explain that too. That's why they need some type of security guarantees for Ukraine to finally end this war.
And also one of the questions I think would be great to raise that that Russian intelligence services view the conflict with the West as continuous and use not only espionage but also hybrid methods, as we discussed, right? From disinformation to sabotage. So how can civil society and educational initiatives build resilience to such influence without creating an atmosphere of fear, of distrust towards all information?
Yeah, I talk about, there's a couple things we can do as societies, understanding the threat from Russian intelligence, and not only them, also our Chinese intelligence adversaries. Experts point out somewhere between 20 to 40%, maybe more, of all the content on the internet right now is AI generated. So constantly, I see it in my own commentary. I've been fortunate in a lot of media appearances the past 3 months. I get a steady huge stream of Russian trolling. Some of it I can tell is not human. Others, it's not as easy to tell. And so I imagine Americans are struggling with the same thing, what's real and what's not. But what we need to know is, again, go back to the fundamental roots of Russian information warfare. What do they target? They target emotions. So I talk to a lot of youth groups, high schools, college kids that I talk to, and I tell them, don't react to the emotion. When you see a post that really upsets you, don't react immediately on emotion with the temptation to repost with vitriol, saying, damn it, I'm not going to allow this to happen. Let me give an example. This is a true story. What happened about a year ago, there was a protest in a Midwestern U.S. state. It was later looked at by the FBI. And there was a rally set up, a sort of flash mob. And I don't remember the exact issue. I think it was guns rights. And so this flash mob in this small Midwestern town, they just started up, and one group said, hey, we heard they're trying to take away our guns. We're not going to let them take away our guns. And the other group was told to show up because some group is trying to put guns in schools. We're not going to allow them to put guns in schools with kids. That's just crazy. And they started shouting with each other and fighting and throwing each other. The police show up, and what do the police want to do? They're trying to de-escalate a potential flash mob, fighting, violence. What's going on here? Who's the leader over here? We don't know. We were told to show up because they want guns in schools. All right, who's the leader over here? We need to put this to an end. What's going on? I don't know. We were told they're going to try to take away guns. I'm not letting them take away my guns. What they found out later was there were no leaders on either side. This was entirely generated by our adversaries online. it can't be that simple for Americans to be turned against each other. We have to be smarter. We can't allow ourselves to be duped. Europe is no different. The election meddling that happened in the United States in 2016 and again in 2020, this is proven fact. This is a DNI, the entire intelligence community agreed on it. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence on the 2016 election. Marco Rubio was chair of that committee. He agreed with the findings. Not for or against any one candidate, but against American democracy. Same thing happened in Brexit. Same thing happened in Hungary with the recent elections there. The Russians are going to meddle against democracy. They're going to pick those issues that we're most emotional about. We can't be so gullible as a population. And it's not only them, it's the Chinese. And one final point, Valeria, this is really important. What the Russians did in 2016 in Brexit, or here in the United States, they did Russian intelligence officers typing on computers, like Prigozhin's Internet Research Agency that he famously founded to help the intelligence services in St. Petersburg. They used proxies, they used organized crime groups as hackers. Now they can do it with AI. Now they can do it in cognitive warfare, and the impact has grown 10,000-fold, if not more. They can push out so much more content because they, of course, have AI just writing the programs for them. So I believe it's the greatest existential threat to democracy today is cognitive warfare by our Russian and Chinese intelligence adversaries against the United States and all of our allies.
And I also emphasized one of the things regarding what you mentioned as an example in 2016 of elections, that the target is the democracy itself.
Yeah.
And I liked how you described that, so people understand that there is no they don't care who would win those elections in 2016. The goal was particularly to undermine the trust to the election itself in the United States, and that's the
and to a degree they succeeded. Unfortunately, to a degree they succeeded. We're still talking about whether there was. And let's remember how Russians function. I lay out the template in my research. I talk about from my work debriefing Russian intelligence officers. They pick emotional topics. They pick the method. Can we bribe a journalist? Can we place a fake story? Can we do social media meddling? They're really fans of that because it worked. And then there's the final piece. It's really important, right? Maskirovka. So denial and deception, what the Russians call maskirovka, and they've been good at it for 100 years. This is where you see the narrative about Venezuelan voting machines, rigged by those darn Venezuelans. It's bullshit. That's the words of our Attorney General Barr. He said it's nonsense. His words, it's bullshit. We looked into that. There's nothing to it. But it's still talked about. That's Russian intelligence. Providing a narrative, or in the case of a narrative is prevented by some other irresponsible party, they amplify it. And you still have Americans talking about, we can't trust those Venezuelan voting machines. Where exactly are those Venezuelan voting machines? There's no fact to it. This is what they do. They plant an emotional issue and they amplify it. And even when the Attorney General of the United States, appointed by President Trump in his first administration, even when he says, Department of Justice looked at that, we didn't find anything, it's nonsense. I believe that, yes, the Russians and Chinese are trying to undermine our very trust in democracy, in the fundamental belief that Americans or Ukrainians or Brits or Germans, we can go to polls and we can free and fairly elect our leaders. Isn't that the greatest threat to Vladimir Putin and to Xi Jinping? As I put in the closing of my book, if Putin had free and fair elections, he wouldn't exist as president in Russia for 26 years. Navalny would have succeeded, Nemtsov, Politkovskaya, others that heroically died trying to share the truth. So democracy is the threat to Putin, and not just Putin, to Xi Jinping as well. Can't have people freely electing their leaders. That's too great of a threat to them. So I think if we recognize that threat too, it helps unite us as Americans, as Europeans and Americans, as a NATO alliance. We realize that we're all under attack.
And I would like to ask one final question, I think, which is very much important for the people to understand. So you're the one who described how the FSB uses also like Telegram to offer young people a small amount of money for seemingly like a little simple tasks, and then after they complete those tasks and get those money, they use fear of the police as leverage, threatening to report what they have done if they refuse to continue to do those tasks. So how can someone recognize those points at which one-time sub job become actually a coercive scheme?
Yeah, this is a dangerous form of escalation the Russians are carrying out. I believe, I've touched on in my Cipher Brief columns, I've talked about, they're the Kremlin kill list, their assassinations, the escalation of sabotage. It's a thugocracy, really. It's a mafia-like state. And what you have is Russian intelligence continually trying to impress the boss, right? Remember, they call Putin chef, right? Chef in Russian, the boss. And I believe what's happening is there's a culture in the Russian intelligence services of got to do what we need to do to make the boss happy. And they get ahead by that. So that's how you see them coming up with increasingly more and more reckless schemes. And one of them was the plot not reported enough were those packages put on airliners to the United States and to other countries in Europe that led to the crash and explosion of the plane in Lithuania. And then another aspect is this recruiting of teenagers, misfits of society. They're recruiting via Telegram and other apps. Now, we need to understand what's happening here and what's not happening. What's happening is they're taking advantage of weaknesses in our societies. Every society has malcontents, disaffected teenagers, drug addicts, others that are struggling, including some refugees from the Ukraine war, including Lithuanians, Estonians, Poles, French. Every society are being targeted. And so, yeah, the Russians entrap a lot of these young. They offer them a couple $1,000s. We just want you to take a picture of a rail line. They don't tell the teenager that they're Russian intelligence. A lot of times they're pretending to be organized crime. We want you to take a picture of this factory because we're targeting it for, we're trying to steal something from there. Just go take some pictures. After these kids do it, then the next step is, hey, we're going to give you a package. We wanted to put over. I'm not putting a package down. I mean, I don't want to go to jail. No, you'll do it. Because you may not know it, but you were working for us now. We're Russian intelligence. Well, they're another trap. Or they're told, you're working for organized crime. You want to go to jail for life? So it is coercion, and it's how they practice kompromat. Compromising material operations, as the Russian intelligence calls it. They've been doing it for 100 years. So this new escalation, they have no accountability. They're more reckless than ever. And I believe fundamentally, though, it goes back to that culture of trying to impress Putin. I think Putin's told them, the boss is sat in conference tables not unlike this one, where he sat back probably with his leaders, the Siloviki, and he said, "Ну что? Ну, как хотите? Whatever you want to do, whatever it takes to counter Ukraine and their allies in NATO, do it. Be creative, find solutions." And that's why we're ending up with more and more recklessness. I'll just end with this final point. It doesn't stop until we present from the United States and NATO a more credible deterrent. I can't imagine President Reagan standing by if packages were put on planes as test explosions. Those packages of GRU, New York Times reported on this, but nobody was really paying attention. Most of the American people, oh, so what? Packages on planes? Doesn't that sound like Al-Qaeda? Doesn't that sound like terrorists? For the past 20 years, 20 years we had war against global war on terror. The GRU was putting packages on planes. One of them blew up in Lithuania. Others were meant to test whether they could get explosives on planes to the United States. I think President Reagan would be fired. There'd be missiles flying. There'd be some proxy of Russia chosen. During the Cold War, we used proxies to prevent all-out nuclear war. Well, when people say things like, oh, we're risking World War III, we're risking World War III. No, we're risking World War III by not countering aggression. We're risking more escalation. We're risking Russia saying, you know what? Let's blow up a couple airlines over the Atlantic. That's what I'm going to do to get promoted within my service at GRU. I know that if I do that, the boss will be really impressed this time because we haven't done anything to counter it. So I believe it's a false narrative that we in the West can prevent further war by giving in to Russia's escalation. No, escalation stops when we counter it. When we say, no, we're not going to tolerate this. We're going to punch back. A bully like Putin understands aggression. He's a schoolyard bully. When he's punched in the face and punched back in the nose, then he'll stop.
Sean, thank you very much for your expertise. Thank you for bringing us such an extensive topics and sharing your knowledge. I think it's incredibly important for society of all the countries, and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the chance. You're one of the first Ukrainian journalists and somebody from your country that you're doing this to try to raise awareness. I admire you all and ALLATRA for doing that. I'm a strong believer in Ukraine. I traveled a lot in your country. It really pains me. It pains me to know that your countrymen are dying by the thousands for freedom. So I believe we can do more. We should do more. I blame Russian intelligence for this war. I blame Putin. I blame the broken kleptocracy of a Russian state. And we need to hold them accountable. So thanks for letting me talk about issues I'm passionate about. Slava Ukraini!
Героям слава!